Before Javiera Jiménez Gallegos became the subject of searches, headlines, and a criminal case, she was a 23-year-old student building an independent life in Antofagasta. And on the day she vanished, she was looking forward, not back. That matters, because it is easy to meet Javiera through the investigation and see only the unanswered questions surrounding her final hours. But the photographs she shared tell a fuller story. They show an energetic young woman with friends, ambitions, and a public presence people recognized. She was a daughter, a sister, a student, a worker, and, increasingly, a social media influencer who was learning how to turn that visibility into another source of income. Javiera had grown up in a close and supportive family. As the eldest daughter, she developed a strong sense of responsibility early. The people around her remembered someone determined to build a life on her own terms. She did not want to wait for independence. She wanted to create it. At 18, she moved out of the family home and began covering her own expenses. Think about that for a second. At an age when many people are still trying to decide what they want, Javiera was already balancing work, education, rent, and plans for the future. She had long been interested in a career in dental care. After high school, she continued her studies with the hope of becoming a skilled professional and, one day, possibly opening a practice of her own. At the same time, she worked as a hostess at a bar. It helped pay the bills, but it also suited her personality. Javiera was comfortable around people. She knew how to make connections and make others feel welcome. That same ability carried over to social media. What began as posts about her daily life gradually attracted a wider audience. She promoted clothing, cosmetics, and other products, working with local brands and developing a recognizable online presence. It was not simply a hobby. Javiera saw it as part of the independent future she was trying to build. And despite the pace of her life, she remained close to her family, especially her mother, Gladys Gallegos. They spoke regularly. Javiera visited, helped at home, and shared her plans. Her family knew what she was working toward because she talked about it openly. Completing her education, increasing her income, expanding her work online, and arranging a better living situation. Then Sutar entered her life. They reportedly met through mutual friends and became romantically involved. At first, people around Javiera did not necessarily see a reason for alarm. He could appear confident and attentive, and the relationship seemed to fit naturally into her social world. Later, however, friends and relatives described concerns that they said Javiera had shared with them. According to those accounts, Sutar became jealous of her work and the people she spent time with. He allegedly wanted explanations about where she was, contacted her repeatedly, appeared without warning, and had difficulty accepting distance in the relationship. Those reports need to be handled carefully. Warning signs are not the same thing as proof, and they do not establish what happened to Javiera. Much of their significance came afterward, once she was missing, and investigators began looking backward through conversations, relationships, and remembered behavior. But the people close to Javiera believed the relationship had become controlling. They said she wanted it to end. They also said Sutar did not accept that easily. By August 2022, Javiera appeared focused on moving ahead. Her parents were planning to relocate, and she expected to stay in the family home, giving her more space while she continued studying and working. She had belongings packed. She had concrete plans. There was a next step waiting for her, and she seemed excited to take it. On August 26th, Javiera spent time with her mother. They went to a shopping mall, had lunch, and talked about the changes ahead. Later, back at the house, Javiera helped with ordinary tasks. Nothing about the day suggested a goodbye. It looked like exactly what it was supposed to be, a young woman preparing for a move and discussing what came next. That evening, Javiera told her mother she planned to stay with a friend. The two continued communicating. Their messages were normal, familiar, still centered on the life Javiera expected to return to. This would become the last confirmed day of her ordinary life, the date around which police would eventually reconstruct an entire journey through WhatsApp exchanges, phone location records, witness accounts, and forensic evidence. And here is the detail her family could never ignore. Nothing in Javiera's known plans suggested that she intended to abandon them or disappear voluntarily. Then a message involving her missing dog gave her a reason to meet the one person whose later account would never sit comfortably with her family. The first alarm was not a scream or an emergency call. It was silence. Javiera stopped answering. She failed to return home. And the ordinary stream of messages marking her day simply ended. August 26, 2022, had begun with plans for the future. Javiera spent part of the day with her mother, Gladys Gallegos. They went to a shopping mall, had lunch, and talked about the changes coming next. Javiera was preparing to move. With her parents planning to relocate, she expected to stay in the family home, giving her more room and another measure of independence. She had already packed her belongings. The following day was supposed to be about moving forward, settling in, continuing her studies, building her social media work, and increasing her income. Nothing in those plans suggested that she intended to vanish. Later, Javiera helped her mother around the house. Before leaving that evening, she said she planned to spend the night with a friend. That was not unusual. After she arrived, she and Gladys continued communicating through messages, discussing the move and the next day. Those exchanges would later become more than family conversation. They would become timestamps. Investigators could use WhatsApp chats and other digital communications to establish when Javiera was active, whom she was speaking with, and when that activity abruptly stopped. A message sent at a certain time does not tell you everything. It cannot show who was standing nearby or what happened after the screen went dark, but it can narrow a disappearance to a window. And in Javiera's case, that window began to close during the night of August 26th. One reported message was especially important. Andres Sutar Araya, Javiera's former partner, allegedly contacted her to say that he had found her missing dog, Lucky. Think about what that would have meant to her. Lucky had disappeared only days earlier. Javiera had been searching for him and had posted online asking for help, even offering a reward. If someone she knew claimed to have found the dog, she had an immediate reason to respond. It may explain why she agreed to meet Sutar or travel with him that night. It does not, by itself, explain what happened next. Sutar became the last known person reported to have been traveling with Javiera. The journey was said to be heading toward the Calama area, away from Antofagasta, and into a landscape where populated streets quickly give way to long roads and open desert. When Javiera did not return and her family began calling around, Sutar offered his version of the night. According to his initial account, he and Javiera had driven around looking for Lucky. When that search failed, he suggested going toward Calama, where he had grown up. He said Javiera agreed and had a suitcase with her because she was preparing to move. Then, he claimed, they argued. Sutar said Javiera realized that her suitcase was missing and believed it had fallen from the vehicle. In his telling, she became upset, got out, and refused to continue the trip. He claimed he left her somewhere along the route because that was what she wanted. That account immediately raised questions for her family. Where, exactly, had he left her? The location was uncertain. At different points, the route was described in ways that did not give Gladys a clear place to search. Was it near Calama? Was it on the return toward Antofagasta? And why would anyone leave Javiera alone beside a remote highway at night without confirming that she had transportation or calling her family? Sutar reportedly added another explanation, that he was later involved in a traffic accident and went to a hospital, which was why he did not return to look for her. But even that did not answer the central question. If Javiera had safely walked away from the vehicle, where had she gone? Nearly 24 hours after she disappeared, Gladys received a message from a number she did not recognize. The sender claimed to be Javiera and said she had left after an accident, needed time, and would return once things were settled. It also told Gladys not to worry and to care for Javiera's grandmother and brother. For a moment, the message appeared to offer what the family desperately needed, proof that Javiera was alive. But Gladys read it again, then again. The wording felt distant. The phrasing did not sound like her daughter, and the message reportedly contained errors that Javiera did not normally make. Friends who knew her texting habits shared the same concern. Why was she writing from an unfamiliar number? What accident was she referring to? Why send a vague message instead of calling? Gladys tried the number. The phone was unavailable. At that stage, the family could not prove who had written the message. Their suspicion was not the same as admissible evidence, and investigators still had to determine whether it had genuinely come from Javiera, had been dictated under pressure, or had been sent by someone else to create the impression that she had left voluntarily. What the family could establish was narrower and more disturbing. Javiera had been in contact with Sutar. She had reportedly traveled with him. Then, during the night, her normal communications stopped. They still did not know where that journey ended, and they did not know whether the final message attributed to Javiera had truly come from her. One version of the night ended beside a highway. The electronic trail pointed investigators toward a far more isolated place. In the Atacama Desert, a witness can forget and a suspect can change his story. A cell phone still records which towers it touched. That became the starting point for the Antofagasta Regional Prosecutor's Office and Chile's Investigative Police, the PDI. They began rebuilding Javiera's final known journey, one fragment at a time. WhatsApp conversations, phone location records, witness statements, surveillance material, and forensic evidence recovered during the investigation. No single piece explained everything. Together, though, they began drawing a route. Investigators examined Javiera's messages from August 26th, including the conversations surrounding her missing dog and the contact that reportedly brought her back into Andrés Sutar's orbit. They compared those exchanges with accounts from relatives and friends. Who had spoken with her? When had she stopped responding? What plans had she shared? And did anything in those conversations suggest that she intended to vanish? Her family's answer was firm. No. Javiera had studies, work, a move in progress, and constant contact with the people closest to her. Her mother and friends rejected the idea that she had simply abandoned all of it without explanation. They also challenged messages supposedly sent in Javiera's name after she disappeared, saying the wording, spelling, and tone did not sound like her. That may seem like a small thing, but think about how well you know the people you message every day. Their punctuation, the phrases they always use, the way they say goodbye. A text can come from a number without truly sounding like the person attached to it. Investigators then turn to the phones themselves. Cell tower evidence is useful, but it is not magic. When a phone connects to a tower, analysts can often place that device within a general network area. By tracking successive connections, they may be able to show movement from one coverage zone to another. What the data usually cannot do, by itself, is place someone on one exact patch of ground. It cannot automatically prove who was holding the phone, and it certainly cannot establish what happened between two people inside a vehicle. Still, when those records are compared with messages, cameras, witness accounts, and physical evidence, the picture can sharpen. The digital trail pointed away from Antofagasta and toward the interior in the direction of Calama. Investigators focused on secondary roads connected to Route B400, roads cutting through a landscape where distances are deceptive and landmarks can be almost non-existent. Surveillance material and witness statements were used to test the timing and movement suggested by the phone data. Forensic evidence recovered during the inquiry added another layer, including evidence connected to the vehicle believed to have carried Javiera. According to the prosecution's reconstruction, Sutar did not remain on the primary route. Investigators allege that he drove Javiera into a remote desert area, where she was killed and her body concealed. But that sequence needs an important label: allegation. The phone data, messages, physical evidence, and witness accounts existed independently as pieces of the investigation. The complete narrative: who was driving at every moment, why the vehicle left the main road, and precisely what occurred in the desert, was the prosecution's interpretation of those pieces, later combined with statements attributed to Sutar. It was not yet a final finding by a court. And even with the corridor narrowed, police faced a brutal problem. The Atacama is not an ordinary search area. It is enormous, dry, exposed, and sparsely traveled. The road network may look limited on a map, but each turnoff can open into miles of empty ground. Search teams were not looking for something visible from the highway. They were looking for one concealed location in one of the most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. A vehicle could leave the paved route, stop beyond the view of passing traffic, and return without creating an obvious trail that would survive for long. Heat, wind, distance, and hard terrain worked against every search. Knowing that a phone had entered a broad coverage area did not tell officers which secondary road to choose, how far to follow it, or where to begin digging. While investigators worked through that map, Javiera's family ran a parallel campaign. They appealed publicly for information, spoke to the media, circulated her image, and kept pressure on authorities to treat the silence as something more serious than a voluntary departure. Every day without an answer made that work harder. It also made it more necessary. By then, the investigation had narrowed Javiera's last known journey to a desert corridor and increasingly treated her disappearance as suspected foul play. But narrowing a map was not the same as finding her. Before police could obtain the one answer that might turn that corridor into a burial site, their central suspect was no longer in Chile. Sutar's departure did more than interrupt an investigation. It forced Javiera's family to live with two absences at once. Their daughter was missing, and the man who might know where she was had vanished too. For a while, Andrés Sutar was still within reach of investigators. He was not yet a convicted criminal. He was a suspect whose account had already raised serious questions, but suspicion alone was not enough to keep him in custody. The authorities had to build a case. They had to establish where Javiera had gone, what had happened to her, and whether Sutar's version could survive contact with the evidence. Then he disappeared. The timing was hard to ignore. As investigators examined the route, the vehicle, the digital records, and the inconsistencies in his story, Sutar left Chile. His car was later found abandoned near Antofagasta, but he was nowhere around. The person who had once claimed he simply left Javiera by the roadside was now the one no one could locate. That changed the question. It was no longer only, what happened to Javiera? It became, where is Andrés Sutar? And what is he trying to stay away from? Investigators began checking the places he might have used to cross the border. The search was complicated by the geography and by the possibility that he had avoided official checkpoints. Northern Chile does not end in a neat line of cities and highways. Beyond the populated areas, there are long stretches of desert, secondary roads, and informal routes where a person can move without leaving the kind of clean record investigators would prefer. And if someone is determined not to be found, even ordinary tools become less useful. A phone can be turned off. A vehicle can be abandoned. Documents can be replaced. A person can stop using the name everyone is searching for. Authorities followed leads that went nowhere. Reports of possible sightings had to be checked, even when they sounded uncertain. A photograph could produce a dozen tips and not one reliable location. Every message carried the same problem. It might be the break the family had been waiting for, or it might be another dead end. For Gladys Gallegos, there was no way to put the search on hold. She spoke to journalists. She kept Javiera's photograph in public view. The family used social media to circulate information, asking people to pay attention to a face that could easily disappear beneath a different name or in a different country. They gave interviews, shared appeals, and followed every possible lead. The goal was not simply to find Sutar. It was to stop Javiera's disappearance from becoming an old story that people remembered only vaguely. More than a year passed. That kind of waiting has its own cruelty. There was no confirmed answer about Javiera, no place where her family could grieve properly, and no courtroom where the allegations could be tested. Instead, there were rumors. A possible sighting here. A piece of information there. Someone claiming to have seen a man who looked like Sutar. Each report had to be investigated, because ignoring the wrong one could mean losing the only chance to find him. But following every lead also meant living through disappointment over and over again. The family continued pushing the case into public view. Photographs were shared. Appeals were repeated. Information about a possible reward circulated, creating another reason for people to come forward with credible details. None of this guaranteed success. Public attention can fade quickly, especially when a case produces no immediate breakthrough. Gladys refused to let that happen. By late 2023, investigators received reports that Sutar might be in Bolivia. The information placed him in Santa Cruz, where he was believed to be keeping a low profile and avoiding official documents. The details still had to be verified. A report was not proof. A name used in another country was not proof. Even finding the right person would not, by itself, establish what had happened to Javiera. It would only bring the investigation to its next stage. Bolivian authorities began working with the information provided to them. The search narrowed from an international flight path to a specific city, then to a possible location. Investigators had to confirm that the man they were tracking was actually Andrés Sutar Araya, not someone mistaken for him. They also had to act within a legal process that crossed national borders. And on January 5, 2024, in Santa Cruz, the search finally ended. Bolivian police located Sutar and arrested him in connection with criminal investigations. He did not remain beyond the reach of the authorities. But an arrest in another country did not automatically prove responsibility for Javiera's disappearance. He was still an accused man, not a convicted one. Extradition procedures were required. Evidence still had to be presented. The Chilean courts would eventually have to decide what could be established, what remained an allegation, and what punishment, if any, the law allowed. Still, for Javiera's family, this was the first real change in 17 months. Sutar was finally in custody. He could no longer simply leave a country, change his routine, or disappear behind a different identity. For the first time, investigators had a realistic chance of asking him where Javiera was. And what broke the case open was not a public confession or a dramatic courtroom exchange. It was information precise enough to send a search team back into the desert. Route B400 runs through a landscape where almost every direction can look the same. This time, investigators were not searching the entire desert. They had been given a place to dig. After Andrés Sutar's arrest in Bolivia in January 2024 and his return to Chile, he provided information about the area where he said Javiera had been buried. For investigators, that was potentially the breakthrough they had been waiting nearly 17 months for. But coordinates are not proof. Not yet. First, the information had to be checked against everything already gathered: cell phone location records, the reconstructed route, witness accounts, and the movements attributed to Sutar on the night Javiera disappeared. If the location contradicted the digital trail, that would matter. If it aligned with the route investigators had already mapped, that would matter too. And then there was the search itself. You hear the police had a location, and it sounds simple. Drive out, find the spot, start digging. But Route B400 cuts through an enormous, exposed section of the Atacama. There are secondary roads, unmarked tracks, hard ground, loose sand, and long stretches with few recognizable landmarks. After more than a year, any disturbance visible in August 2022 could have been softened by time. A shallow depression might be significant, or it might be nothing. So this could not be treated as an ordinary search. Teams had to reach the indicated area without damaging whatever might still be there. Investigators and forensic personnel needed secure access to the site. The ground had to be examined systematically. Anything recovered had to be photographed, documented, and preserved in place before removal. That careful process was crucial. If this location eventually became part of a criminal trial, every step would be questioned. Who entered the area? What did they touch? Where, exactly, was each item found? Could anything have been moved or contaminated? The desert had preserved a secret for 17 months. Investigators now had one chance to recover it correctly. Search teams moved into the area near Route B400 in January 2024, following the information Sutar had supplied. The setting made the scale of the task painfully clear. Antofagasta and Calama are connected by vast distances, and once a vehicle leaves a main route, the landscape offers countless places where something could remain hidden. Then the search narrowed. In the indicated area, investigators found human remains concealed in the desert. The discovery was handled as a forensic scene. The location was secured, the site was documented, and specialists began the process of recovering what had been found. For Javiera's family, the news brought a terrible possibility closer than ever before. The remains had been located where the central accused said a body had been buried. That connection was an important investigative development. It linked his information to a physical place and gave authorities evidence that could be studied. But it did not settle everything. Finding human remains in that area did not immediately establish that they belonged to Javiera. It also did not prove every detail of the prosecution's reconstruction: how she died, precisely when it happened, or who was legally responsible. Those were separate questions, requiring separate evidence. And that distinction forced her family into another weight. After 17 months of uncertainty, they still could not receive an immediate official answer. Scientific identification is not based on recognition, assumption, or the apparent fit of a location. Forensic specialists had to examine the remains and compare biological evidence with verified samples connected to Javiera. The results had to meet the standard required not only to inform a grieving family, but also to withstand scrutiny in court. Think about what that meant for her mother and the people who loved her. They had spent more than a year asking where Javiera was. Now something had been found in the desert, and every circumstance pointed toward the answer they feared. Still, officially, they had to wait. January passed. Then February, March, and April. Only in May 2024 did science provide the confirmation. The remains recovered near Route B400 belonged to Javiera Jiménez Gallegos. The search for her was finally over. Her remains were released to her family, allowing them to bring Javiera home and say goodbye on their own terms. It was an answer, but not relief in any ordinary sense. For nearly 17 months, they had lived with the possibility that she might still be somewhere waiting to be found. The identification ended that uncertainty by replacing it with something permanent, and it changed the legal center of the case. This was no longer only an investigation into a disappearance. Chilean prosecutors were now pursuing a femicide case, built around the allegation that Sutar had killed Javiera and concealed her body in the desert. His information had led investigators to the recovery site. The scientific comparison had established identity. What remained was to determine which parts of the prosecution's account could be proved, and whether the evidence established criminal responsibility beyond the discovery itself. In May 2024, Javiera's family finally learned where she had been. But finding her was not the same as proving the case against the man accused of taking her there. The desert had answered the question of identity. It had not delivered a verdict, and the evidence now had to survive a courtroom. A criminal case is not the same thing as an investigative theory. Prosecutors now had to transform messages, location data, testimony, forensic findings, and Sutar's own information into one sequence a court could test. Their alleged sequence begins with Lucky, Javiera's missing dog. Javiera had been searching for him and posting appeals on social media. Prosecutors say communication connected to that search helped bring Javiera and Andrés Sutar together on August 26, 2022. The promise that her dog had been found, or that Sutar could help her find him, was not a minor detail. It explained why she might agree to meet a former partner whose controlling behavior had already worried people close to her. But it could not, by itself, prove what Sutar intended. That distinction runs through the entire case. A message can establish contact. It may help establish timing. It can show what Javiera believed when she left. What it cannot automatically reveal is what was in the sender's mind. From Antofagasta, the prosecution alleges Javiera and Sutar traveled toward the Calama area. Investigators reconstructed that movement through WhatsApp conversations, cell phone location records, witness accounts, and other evidence gathered after Javiera disappeared. The data did not provide a video of every moment. What it did provide was a route, one that moved away from the city and toward secondary desert roads connected to Route B400. And that is where the prosecution's account becomes a murder allegation. According to prosecutors, Sutar took Javiera into the desert, shot her, and concealed her body. They argue that the remote location was not incidental. In their version of events, it was part of the plan. A place far from witnesses, surrounded by terrain so vast that a search could continue for months without finding the right patch of ground. Prosecutors also placed Sutar's later flight from Chile within that same chain. After Javiera vanished and suspicion centered on him, he left the country, crossed into Bolivia, and remained there until his arrest in January 2024. Flight is not, on its own, proof of murder. People can flee for different reasons, especially when other investigations are involved. But prosecutors can ask the court to consider whether his departure, viewed alongside the rest of the evidence, reflects an attempt to avoid responsibility. Then there is the fact that changed the case completely. Sutar provided information that directed investigators to the burial area. Think about the legal significance of that for a second. Search teams had been dealing with one of the largest and most unforgiving landscapes on Earth. Yet the information connected to Sutar narrowed that expanse to a location where human remains were actually recovered. In May 2024, scientific examination identified them as Javiera's. That identification establishes something beyond argument. Javiera was found there. Sutar's knowledge of the site may also be powerful evidence that he knew what happened after her disappearance. But even powerful evidence has limits. Knowledge of a burial location does not automatically settle every legal question surrounding the killing. A court must still examine how he obtained that knowledge, the context in which he supplied it, and whether his statements are supported by independent evidence. It must also decide what the evidence proves about planning and intent. That is why the route reconstruction matters. So do the final communications. So does testimony placing Javiera and Sutar together. Each piece may reinforce the others. Prosecutors are not asking the court to view the burial location information in isolation. They are presenting it as the final link in an alleged chain beginning with the dog, continuing through the drive from Antofagasta, and ending beside Route B400. The prosecution has pursued the case as femicide and has sought qualified life imprisonment if Sutar is convicted. That is among the harshest penalties available under Chilean law. To secure it, however, prosecutors must prove not merely that Javiera died or that Sutar knew where she was buried. They must establish the elements of the charged offense to the legal standard required at trial. And there are issues the court will have to test carefully: how accurately the digital records reconstruct movement, how particular messages and statements should be interpreted, the exact sequence of events in the desert, whether the evidence establishes premeditation, and whether femicide is the proper final legal classification. None of those questions can be decided by public suspicion, however strong that suspicion may be. Andrés Sutar remains an accused defendant. The prosecution's case links the final communications, the desert route, his flight, and his knowledge of the burial location into one alleged chain. Whether that chain proves femicide beyond the required legal standard remains a question for trial. By March 2026, Javiera's family was ready to hear that evidence tested in open court. Then an empty chair stopped the proceeding before it could properly begin. Nearly 4 years after Javiera vanished, the oral trial was postponed, not because the evidence had disappeared, but because Sutar's defense lawyer failed to appear. The hearing had been scheduled for March 2026. It was supposed to be the point where the prosecution's reconstruction would finally be tested in open court. Instead, the proceedings were delayed before that process could begin. On paper, a postponement can sound procedural: a scheduling problem, a missing attorney, a new date to be arranged. For Javiera's family, it means something else. It means more waiting after August 26, 2022, when Javiera stopped answering her phone. More waiting after the search across northern Chile. After Andrés Sutar left the country and authorities tracked him to Bolivia. After his arrest in January 2024. After the information that directed investigators toward Route B400. After human remains were recovered from the desert. And after the family had to wait until May for science to confirm that those remains belonged to Javiera. Each step answered something. None of them brought the legal process to an end. And this distinction matters. Andrés Sutar Araya is the accused defendant in this case. He has been held in pretrial detention and is facing prosecution. But in the available record, he has not yet been finally convicted of killing Javiera. The prosecution has presented a detailed theory. Investigators have assembled digital records, witness accounts, forensic findings, and information connected to Sutar himself. But allegations, even serious allegations supported by substantial evidence, still have to be examined by a court. That is what the postponed trial is meant to do. Prosecutors are pursuing the case as femicide. If Sutar is convicted under that legal classification, they are seeking qualified life imprisonment, one of the most severe penalties available under Chilean law. But the judges must first decide what the evidence proves, not only whether Sutar was criminally responsible, but also whether the prosecution has established intent, premeditation, and the legal elements required for that specific charge. Those questions cannot be resolved by a headline. They cannot be settled simply because Sutar led investigators to a burial location. And they cannot be answered by the understandable certainty of a grieving family. They belong to the trial. Still, some parts of this case are no longer uncertain. The remains recovered near Route B400 were scientifically identified as Javiera's. The family finally learned where she had been taken. The 17-month search for her ended in the Atacama Desert. What remains unresolved is how every piece of that journey should be interpreted, and what criminal responsibility the court will ultimately assign. Was the digital route enough to demonstrate planning? What weight will the court give the WhatsApp conversations, cell phone location records, witness testimony, and forensic evidence? How will the defense challenge the prosecution's timeline? And how much can be inferred from the information Sutar provided after his arrest? That is the uncomfortable place where the case now stands. The central physical question has been answered. The judicial questions have not. Through all of it, Gladys Galagios has remained Javiera's public voice. When Javiera could no longer answer messages, correct rumors, or explain what happened, her mother kept her name in public view. Gladys pushed for searches, demanded answers, spoke through the long period of uncertainty, and waded through the identification process. Now she is waiting again. this time for a court to decide what can be proven. But Javiera should not be remembered only through that courtroom, and she should not be reduced to coordinates beside a desert road. Look back at her photographs and you see the life that existed before this case. A 23-year-old student, daughter, sister, and young woman building an audience online. She was working toward financial independence. She had plans for her education, her career, and a new home. Her future was not an abstract idea. She had already started creating it. That is the life behind every location record and forensic report. The Atacama held Javiera's location for 17 months. The search eventually reached its answer, and science gave her family certainty about whose remains had been recovered. But the courts are still deciding what can be proven about how she came to be there. When the oral trial finally proceeds, which part of the investigative trail do you think will matter most? The cell phone data? The messages? The witness accounts? The forensic findings? Or Sutar's information about the burial site? Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for verified updates as the proceedings continue.